Okay, in the last video we have learned about photosynthesis, we have learned about fertilizers and the importance of water in the life of the plants. Today in this video we will learn about the different parts of the flower. We have seen flowers of different color, different shades and varieties of flower we see in our everyday life, isn't it? In our garden, in our environment, here and there and everywhere. So now today let's study about the parts of the flower, or the different parts of the flower. You know, flowers are the reproductive organs of the plants, and the main parts of the flowers are the stamens, the carpels, the petals and the sepals. I have a flower here. If you want, you also can take a flower like this and dissect the flower by yourself and see the different parts of it at your home, so that you can better understand this. This is the most simplest flower you can take and you can experiment it yourself. So, as I said, the flower has the 4 different parts. The 4 different parts mainly are what? The stamen, the pistil, the sepal and the petal. They are the 4 main different parts of the plant. Stamens are the male part of the plant, flower, and pistil are the female part of the flower. So let's begin with. Here you will find in some flowers both the male and the female part are present, and in some flowers you will find that one of the missing. That means in some flowers you will find only the male part is present, whereas in some flowers you may find that only the female part is present. The flower which comprises of both the parts, they are known as perfect flower. They are known as perfect flower as they contain both the male and the female part. For example, you can take like roses, lilies, dandelion and etc. And the flowers which do not contain one of them, or it contains only one, that's the male or the female, they are known as imperfect flower. They are known as imperfect as they miss one of the part. For examples, you can take like cucumber, papaya, they are the examples of imperfect flower. Okay, keeping this beside, let's go into the parts of the flower. The first part of the flower which comes when you hold a flower in your hand, it is this part, isn't it? This green color part. This green color part is called what? Pedicel. It is the stalk of the flower. It is the stalk of the flower. Next, if you go a little above, here in the middle or the center of the flower, you will get receptacle. This forms the base, or it's found at the center of the flower to which the pedicel is attached, or to which the stalk of the flower is attached. If you move a little bit above, you can see these green color small structures. These are known as saples. They are green or leaf-like structures. They are small and they are found at the base of the flower or below the petals. The collection of these saples are called calyx, C-A-Y-L-X. The collection of these saples are called calyx. And what is their main function? Their function is to protect the flower till it blooms. Now, if you move a bit above, or you go above the sepal, you will get the petals, means this. These are the petals of the flowers, which are brightly colored, and they are large in shape, or they are in some flowers they are also small in shape. So they differ in shape as well as in size as well as in color. So these petals, they are just above the sepal, they are just above the sepal layer, and they are brightly colored. Now why they are brightly colored? Their main function is to attract the insects and birds and bats, etc. for the reason of pollination, or for the reason for pollination to take place in the flower. Their main function is to attract insects. You should keep in mind that flowers are brightly colored because their main function is to attract the insects, small birds and small insects, so that they can pollinate the flower. Next, if we go above the petals, you will get this. Here you will find the male part, this. These are the stamens. They are the male parts of the flower. These male parts, they comprises of 2 different parts, that is another anther and filament. As well as in the diagram, you can see that they are known as the filament, and the head of this are known as the anther. That means if I take out one from here, that you can do at home. You just take a flower and then you can separate the different parts, and you can see these parts, these small filaments, they are known as filaments and anther. So what is filament? Filament is the long and a slender tube to which the anther is attached. What is anthers? Anther are the head of the stamen. They are head of the stamen or head of the male part. And inside the anther, pollen grains are produced, which are later transferred to the female part of the flower for fertilization or for pollination. So this is the male part. And the collection of these stamens are known as Angosium. The collection of stamens are known as Angosium. And it comprises of two parts. What are they? Anther and filament. Anther is the head of the stamen, and filament is a long, slender structure to which the anther is attached. Next, moving again, we will find now the female part of the flower. See, this is the female part of the flower. If we remove all these things, if we remove the stamens and all, you can see this part is the female part. And then this female part is also called the pistil. P-I-S-T-I-L, pistil. It's the female part which contains the female gametes. Now, the collection of this pistil is known as Angosium. Now, this pistil is also divided into four parts. What are they? They are style, stigma, ovary and ovule. If I have to draw this part, see this, is the female part of the flower. Here, this part is called the stigma. This long cylindrical stalk is called the style. This we have the ovary, and inside this we have the ovules, which contain the female gametes. Style is what? It is a slender stalk which holds the stigma. What happens when a pollen grain reaches to the stigma? What does the style do? The style, it becomes hollow and it forms a narrow tube inside this, which carries the pollen grain from the stigma to the ovary or to the ovule. The function of the style is to help the pollen grain to reach from the stigma to the ovary by forming a tube inside the style, which is known as the pollen tube. Now, what does the stigma do? The tip of the style is the stigma, or it is the head of the pistil. Now, this stigma, they contain or they have a sticky like substance which catches the pollen grains that are dispersed by wind, water or sometimes by the insects. And so they are responsible for the process of fertilization to occur. Then next we have the ovary. Moving next, you will find this ovary. This ovary is the base of the pistil. They form the base of the pistil or they form the base of the flower, and inside it holds the ovules or the egg cells also, you can say. Ovules are what? The egg cells or the female gametes. So inside the ovary we have the ovules. And finally the ovules. As I said, the ovules are the egg cell of the flower. They are contained inside the ovule. What happens? In a favorable pollination, when a pollen grain reaches the stigma, it then eventually reaches the ovary and penetrates in the ovule where the fertilization takes place, leading to the formation of what? Food and seed. These are the different parts of the flower. And we have to remember that flowers are the reproductive organs of the plants. So here we have learned about the different parts. What are the different parts? the male parts, they have mainly two different parts, that is the male and the female part. The male part is called the stamen, the female part is called the pistil. The male part is further divided into anther and filament. The female part is further divided into style, stigma, ovary and ovule. So this is the complete diagram of a part of a flower. Okay. As now what we have seen the different parts of the flower. At the beginning I say the flowers are differently colored, the petals are differently colored. Why? To attract insects. Now why to attract insects? Why they have to attract insects? They have to attract insects so that the pollination takes place. Now what is pollination? So in this, now you will learn about pollination, fertilization, how seeds are formed, and lastly we will also learn about seed dispersal. Now firstly, let us learn about pollination. Now as I have said that the flowers are brightly colored so as to attract the insects and the butterflies and all. So what they will do, the insects, they will come and they will suck nectar from the flower, right? And during this time what will happen, the pollen grains, they will get stuck to the body of the insects like moths and bees or butterflies, and when the same insect go to the another flower and sit on the another flower for sucking nectar, what will happen, the pollen grains will fall off from their body and get stick to the stigma of the another flower. That means what? The transfer of pollen grains. Okay, the transfer of pollen grains from the male anther of the flower to the female stigma of the flower is known as pollination. So the process or the transfer of pollen grains from the male anther to the female stigma is called as pollination. And who helps them? The insects like butterflies, moths and bees, those they help the flowers to get pollinated. Now here, not only the butterflies and the insects, sometimes even the water or the wind, the abiotic factors also help the plants to get pollinated. Now why we need to do pollination? See, the goal of every living organisms, including plants too, their main goal is to reproduce a new one. We humans, we have the ability to reproduce a new offspring or a new baby. Similarly, the plants here also do the same thing. They also need to bring or give birth to a new offspring for the next generation. So for that, pollination is the very beginning or the very step which is much needed in the environment to take place. So that is why the flowers are brightly colored. That's why the insects get attracted to them, and they are known as the pollinating agents. The pollinating agents. Who are they? They are the insects, birds, bats, bees, moths. So they are the pollinating agents. And there are other abiotic pollinating agents also like wind and water. They also help the flowers to get pollinated. So simple words, you can say that pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of a flower. And what are the pollinating agents? They are the wind, water, birds, insects, etc., etc. And how it occurs? I have already explained how it occurs. One insect, they visit one plant or sit on a flower, it sucks the nectar from the flower and the pollen grains get stuck to its body. When the same insect goes and sit on another flower, the pollen grains fell off from its body and stick to the stigma to the flower, where the flower gets pollinated and there the fertilization occurs. Now you will also get to know pollination are of two types. They are self-pollination and cross-pollination. One is self-pollination, another one is cross-pollination. At the beginning, as I have said, some flowers, they have both the female and the male part. Those flowers are called what? Perfect flowers. So those flowers can do or perform self-pollination, because the flower have both the male and the female part. So self-pollination occurs in them. Example like roses, lilies, etc. And cross-pollination, where the pollinating agents has a major role to play. Isn't it? Those flowers which only contain one part of the either the male part or the female part, their cross-pollinations takes place. Okay. Now, if I talk about wind-pollinated flowers and insect-pollinated flowers, I can give you examples like wind-pollinated flower. For wind-pollinated flowers, what happens? There will be no flowers. Okay, you can take an example of grass or crops like barley, wheat, rice. They do not have much nectar or scent. They don't have brightly colored flowers because they don't attract insects. What these plants do, they release millions of pollen grains in the year, and when they release this in the year, and few of the, or you can say lucky ones, go and attack the target. Go and attack the target means go and attack the, or go and get settled into the stigma of another flower. Okay, and insect pollinated are the pollinating agents, so their flowers have to be brightly colored, they should have a good scent, and they should be large enough. And wind pollinated flowers, what are they? They are not bright flowers, they are no scent, only the pollen grains must be lightweight. The pollen grains must be lightweight, sticky and airborne. Now, pollination is done. Pollination means what? The transfer of pollen grains from the male anther to the female stigma. Now, what happens after pollination? Pollination is done. Okay, the anther it got attached to the stigma of the female part. After pollination, fertilization will occur because pollination is the first step of fertilization. Okay, now what is fertilization? In sexual reproduction, when the female nucleus mixes or fuses with the male nucleus, okay, they form a new cell which is called the zygote. Okay, which is the zygote. They form a new cell which is a zygote, and that process is called fertilization. Means what? When a male gamete and a female gamete fuses, they form a new cell which is the zygote, and this process is called the fertilization. The same thing happens in human beings. Similarly, it also happens in the plants too. So now let us see the steps, okay, how fertilization in plants occurs or in the flowers occurs. So as I have said, fertilization is the fusion of what? Female gamete and the male gamete, where both the nucleuses diffuses or join together for making a new cell. Now let us break down the process of fertilization into very simple 4 steps. Okay? The first step is what? Pollination. The first step is pollination, step 1. Okay, so as I have said, the steps of fertilization can be divided into 4 simple steps. The first step is pollination. The second step is germination. Then comes the third step, which is penetration. Penetration into the ovule. And the last step is the fusion of the gametes or the fusion of the nuclei. Okay, so the first step, we have already seen what is pollination. We have already seen the pollination. So pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the male anther to the female stigma. See in the diagram. This diagram is showing you the process of fertilization. Firstly, the pollen grain, it comes and sticks to the stigma, that is the pollination done. After pollination is done, after a few minutes, what happens? The pollen grain forms the pollen tube. From the pollen grain, a tube connecting the pollen grain forms or begins. As I have said at the beginning, the style. This is the style of the flower, the female part. So this style, what happens? It makes a passage for the pollen grain to reach the ovary, and this is known as the pollen tube. It starts to divide, form a hollow tube which is the pollen tube, and through the pollen tube what happens? The pollen grains move from the stigma to the ovary. Okay, that is germination. After this, after they reach the ovary, what they do? The pollen grain. What does the pollen grain contain inside them? The pollen grain contains the male gamete, which contains the male nucleus or the nucleus inside the male gamete. The pollen grains are the carriers of the male gametes. So they carry the male gamete from the tip of the stigma to the ovary and reaches. And when they reach reaches the ovule. So what is the first step? The first step is the pollination. The second step is the germination. After the pollen grains are stick to the stigma, they pass through the pollen tube and reaches the ovary. After they reaches the ovary, what happens? Penetration into the ovule. The pollen grain, what it do? This pollen grain, after coming from there to here, the pollen grain or the male gamete, it fuses in, it penetrates into the ovule. It penetrates into the ovule. See, this is the ovary, it penetrates into the ovary and goes inside the ovule. This is the ovule and it goes inside the ovule. So this is the third step. And finally what happens? When it penetrates the ovary or the ovule and goes inside, there in this place the fusion of both the gametes takes place. And a new cell, what was that? And a new cell called zygote get formed or they produce a new cell. So the steps of fertilization is very easy. First is pollination, then germination, thirdly penetration, and lastly the fusion of the gametes. The fusion of the gametes takes place inside the ovule, which carry the egg cell, and they form a new cell, which is the zygote. Okay? Done? Then what happens next? After fertilization is done. Okay? So from here what we have done? We have done pollination, we have done fertilization. Now next what happens? After fertilization, I say the zygote is formed, right? This zygote is formed. Now this zygote is, what happens? It starts to divide itself into little groups of cells or small groups of cells, which is called the embryo. Embryo or the growing plant, or you can also name it as developing plant. So this zygote, it divides itself and it forms small groups of cells, which is called the embryo. Okay, and this embryo eventually grows into a new plant, or it gives a new offspring. No? It gives a new birth to a new plant or a new offspring. And what happens to this ovule then? This ovule, what happens? This is the ovule, no? And inside this the fertilization occurs, and this is the zygote. What happens to ovule? The ovule also changes. Okay, the ovule also changes, and it gets changes and it forms the seed. It becomes what? It becomes the seed. It gradually grows into a seed, and inside, see in the diagram, this is the ovule which becomes the seed, and inside this is the zygote which becomes the embryo, the new plant. Now the embryo is what? It's stored in a seed capsule. That means it is stored inside the seed. It is dormant until the environmental conditions become favorable for its development or for its growth into a new plant. Okay? Now what happened? After fertilization, what happened? New plant is formed, the zygote is formed, or the embryo is formed. Embryo is inside the ovule. This is the ovule which becomes the seed. Inside the ovule is the embryo. Now what happens to ovary? What happens to ovary? This part. This part. What happens to this part? This part also changes. The ovary also changes. Okay, the ovary also changes and it gets ripened. And in some cases it becomes flashy, such in case of berries. Such in case of berries and drups, and in some cases it also converts itself into a hard covering, for example in nuts. So see, the ovule remains inside the ovary itself, but it changes itself into the seed, and inside the seed you have the embryo, that is the new plant, and the outer covering is what? The ovary, which changes itself into a flashy or a hard covering, which forms the fruit. This is our fruit. This is a fruit. Thus, what is a fruit? Fruit is a seed-bearing structure in a flowering plant. It is a seed-bearing structure in a flowering plant. So, we have also known about seed formation, how seeds are formed or how fruits are formed. Okay? So, fruit formation and seed formation, they are all the result of fertilization. After fertilization, they form a new cell, which is the embryo, and then the ovary changes itself into the fruit, and the ovule gets converted into the seed. So, here we get the fruit as well as the seed. So, fruit is a seed-bearing structure in a flowering plant. Lastly, we will also learn about seed dispersal. seed dispersal? Seed dispersal is the movement, spread or transfer of seeds away from the parent cell. Away from the parent cell. This is seed dispersal. And for, as plants have limited mobility, they depend on the other factors, both as biotic and abiotic factors for the seed dispersal. Just like insects, birds, animals, sometimes by wind and water also. Now you might ask me why it is important for seed dispersal. Why? Because see, when a plant bears fruit, the seeds may fall off from the plant. Okay, and the seeds which fell off from the ground, it will try to grow in the same place, right? But for each plant to grow well and healthy, what they do need? They need proper amount of sunlight, water and minerals. Now if in a small place, if too many plants are growing, then they will not get the appropriate amount of nutrients which they want. And in that case, the plants will not be able to grow or they may die out. So in order to survive, they need a bigger space. They need a space for themselves. That's why seeds need to be dispersed. Now for example, you can do an experiment at your home also. You can take a pot and you can plant 2-3 plants or flowers in the same pot. But after a few days, what you can see, you will see that the plants are not growing. Why? Because they are not getting the appropriate amount of nutrients which they need. They also need some space around them, but they are not getting, because of which they are not growing. So it's become very important. It's very important for dispersal also. The seeds should be moved away from the parent plant so that they can grow individually. Okay. Now how do plants do that? Plants disperse their seeds in a variety of ways. Okay. Some seeds are transported by wind and water. Some are shaped as, their stem are shaped in such a way that they can float and spin through the air. And sometimes they are also taken away by animals. Some seeds even they explode, throwing the seed from the parent plant to a great distance. So these are some of the ways how seed dispersal takes place. It is also a natural occurring phenomena where seed dispersal is important. Why? Because so that the plants can grow healthier. So here we have also learned about the seed dispersal. So we have learned about pollination, we have learned about fertilization. After fertilization, what are the products and what we get? We get the fruit and the seed, and why seed dispersals are also important. So with the explanation of seed dispersal, we have come to the end of this chapter, or we have come to the end of Unit 1 plants. So let us just quite quickly revise what we have learned in this video or in this chapter. The first thing which we have learned is the photosynthesis. So what is photosynthesis? It's a process by which plants make food for themselves with the help of water, sunlight and carbon dioxide. Secondly, we have learned about fertilizers. What are fertilizers? They are chemical substances which are provided to the crops to increase their productivity. Then we have also learned about the importance of water in the plant's life. What were they? They were plant water for support, water for transport, water for photosynthesis and water for cooling down. Secondly, we have learned about the parts of a flower, about the different parts of the flower and what are their functions. Then we have learned about pollination, the transfer of the pollen grains from the anther to the stigma and how it occurs or how it is done. After that, we have also learned about the fertilization in flowering plants. After pollination, what happens? What are the processes that takes place inside the flower? And then we have learned how the seed or the fruits are formed, how they are formed as a result of fertilization in the plants. And lastly, we have also learned about the seed dispersal, how it is done, why it is done, and why should it be done, right? So with this, we have came to the end of this video and as well as with this chapter. Thank you.